film, not film, brief tour, I guess, for the Korean Cultural Association in LA of our collection. And so I will send that link to you if you want to look at it. It's pretty general. I thought I was just going in and being interviewed a little bit about a couple of works of art, and then I ended up having to talk about stuff that I wasn't, ready to talk about. So, but it is interesting. So I will send it to you, and it has some information that's good. But today we are going to be talking about Korean culture, its history, and its art as reflected and related to our collection. So I'm thinking about time periods and things that matter for us, for you when you're talking about our works of art. And actually, Michelle, when I was doing this, I was like, kept putting ceramics in because Korean ceramics art is one of the most important, well-known, I guess I would say, art forms. So I have a feeling I'm going to cover what needs to be covered today. But if we need more information, I'm happy to do another thing, if that works.
Absolutely.
If you don't have anything else happening today, I hope you all have some caffeinated beverages. Okay. And I will try to be energetic and exciting. Okay. And I'll try not to talk too long because I know that's really bad. So here we go. So Korea is known as the land of the morning calm. I love that, right? That's such a beautiful kind of visual that you get when you think of Korea. And if I were just to say anything about touring our we don't have a large Korean collection. And so that's one thing to consider. But the other thing that I think is important to recognize is that Korea, China, and Japan are three separate places and three separate cultures. And so when you are touring East Asia, and I'm sure that I'm telling you what you already know, the obvious, you really want to make sure that you don't act like they're all the same, because they're not. And there have been things that have happened in modern history between these cultures. And when I'm thinking of Korea, I'm specifically thinking of Japan. Because Japan, and by the way, I love the art of Japan. I love anybody who's seen me. I'm crazy about Japanese woodblock prints and have studied them. But in modern history, Japan took over Korea, and a lot of really difficult things happened to the people of Korea under that rule. So you definitely don't want to act like these three cultures are the same, because they're really not. And so just to be aware of that, which I know you understand that already. So here we have two vessels. The one on the left is Korean, and the one on the right, of course, as you know, is Chinese. And these are both in our collection. And so when you look at the one on the right, scholars, by looking at this vessel, by the shape of the shoulders, of course, the top part of the vessel, and so on, can place it in time. It's that precise in China. And you can also see that secret decoration, which you can't see very well here, but you can when you're looking at it in the gallery, was planned very carefully before it was put on this vessel. And then you look at the vessel on the left, a similar shape. But here you can see the hand of the artist. You can see actually how it was shaped on the wheel. And you can also see the decoration is very kind of almost spontaneous, very gestural. You can imagine the hand of the artist as they're moving across this vessel. So often there is this idea of distinguishing Korean works from Chinese works, and often you will hear the words exuberant and spontaneous and naturalistic and things like that, to kind of talk about this kind of gesture that you're seeing in terms of this decoration. And in some cases, I think that's true, especially in folk art. We see a lot of that in folk art. But I want you to also be aware that, for instance, this vessel on the right is also Korean. And it is an incredible work of art. and we don't own it. But what I want you to see here is that the form, we don't see the hand of the artist in the form, right? We can see that the decoration was carefully applied and planned. And so that Korean art and artists can also be just as precise as what we see in Chinese art. Keep going. So what you need to know. Koreans have an incredible connection to nature. So they have shamanistic beliefs that go all the way back in time, way early in the history of Korea, and spirits of sun, stars, earth, moon, water, rocks, and trees. But so you have to understand that even as Koreans become Buddhist and so on, there's still this underlying respect for nature and this belief in nature spirits. And this, we see this in other places as well. We see this in Japan, and real reverence for nature as well, but we're talking about Korea today. And Korea was united for the most part from the 600s to 1945. Of course, that last part underneath Japanese rule. But I think a lot of people don't know that, right? When they think about Korea, they think of North and South Korea. But for the most part, it was a united place. And it was a place that was the last to really have a lot of contact with the West. And although there are people of different backgrounds in Korea, they consider themselves a very homogeneous society. They were influenced by the culture of China, and we'll see that, but they have their own aesthetic and they have their own ways of looking at art. And that's something we want to think about. And then those words that I discussed before that sometimes we see in Korean art and then other times not. Here's Korea, right here. And you can see that at one time this was all Korea, or most of this was all Korea, that they, North Korea borders, of course, Russia and China, and then we have Japan over here. And for much of its history, Korea is a place where we have kind of a little brother, big brother relationship with China, and sometimes an aggravated relationship with Japan on occasion, but we'll talk about that later. 70% mountains. I think that's something also to be aware of. I think the topography, when we ask ourselves, and I think this is important that we should always do this, when we look at work of art, we should always ask ourselves, why does the work of art look the way it does, right? And I know you all who know me know I say that all the time, but I think it's an important inquiry. And of course, it's not just that the artist made it that way, but also the cultural and historical factors that surround the artist. And the fact that Korea is 70% mountains, of course, there are mountain spirits, right? The mountains are so important in the culture. And in fact, here are some examples of mountain deities that were often worshipped by the rulers of Korea. And often they're depicted with a tiger. I'm just showing you a couple here just so you can see that these mountain deities are very important in the culture of Korea, and that the mountains themselves are important. So there's only 20% of Korean land is arable or farmable. And I think that's also important to understand when we're thinking about Korea. And I've already told you they've been unified for some time, so I don't need to continue that. Now, I'm showing you the relevant periods of history in Korea that matter for our collection. And really, honestly, I would say that these two areas are the most important for our collection, the Koryo dynasty and the Joseon dynasty. But we are going to talk a little bit about these earlier areas, earlier time periods. So the Three Kingdoms is the time period where there were four kingdoms in what is now known as Korea today. And this is a time period where we see Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism entering Korea from China. And Buddhism is going to become very important slowly and become really the state religion during the Koryo dynasty down here. Then we see these three kingdoms being unified by the Shilla. It's not Silla, Shilla, okay? The Shilla dynasty. And this is when we see the beginning of the unified Korea. And we see Buddhism really becoming even more important during that time period. Then the Koryo dynasty, which is the time of the Celadon ceramics, really the pinnacle, I would say, of ceramic production. in Korea. And ceramics very important as an art form in Korea generally, but specifically well known, I think more well known than other types of art forms from Korea, outside of Korea, and most likely because they were very transportable, right? People would go to Korea and able to take a work of art back. We're going to see Buddhism being the state religion in the Koryo dynasty. And then we have the Joseon dynasty. That's a really long dynasty, right? Almost 500, almost 600 years. And at this time, Buddhism is pushed to the side. Buddhism in the Koryo dynasty towards the end becomes very powerful. There's a lot of money. They are actually, there's some Buddhist temples and monks are considered to be almost taking advantage of the everyday person, and they have a lot of power. And so when we see this new dynasty rise up, we're going to see a lot of regulation on Buddhism. Many Buddhist monks are pushed out of the cities and into the mountains. Many temples are closed, but Buddhism is going to continue, even though it is no longer the state ideology. It's going to continue to be important, and really important for many of the elites. And so you're going to still see works of art surrounding Buddhism made during this time period. We have quite a few, and I'm sure some of you are making are doing your reports on them. Then we have the colonization of Korea by Japan, and of course the north-south split that starts after World War II. So let's talk about the three kingdoms. I'm doing some dancing, so keep you awake, okay? So the three kingdoms, here we go. Now, y'all, look at this. Actually, there are four kingdoms. Do you see? But very quickly, this particular kingdom gets kind of absorbed into another kingdom. And the Shilla, which are down here, are going to end up uniting much of this part of Korea at the end of this period. And they're going to do it with the help of the Tang dynasty in China. And then they're going to throw off the kind of Tang dynasty yoke and start to rule on their own. But notice too that the Shilla is down here in an area that there's going to be a lot of trade. So we see a lot of influence in the art of the Shilla from other places. And that eventually is going to affect the art in a much bigger part of Korea. And this is an example of a vessel of a duck. Ducks were really important cultural symbols in Korea. They were harbingers of good fortune. People would often have ducks on their, actually images of ducks on their homes. And they also are kind of related to harmony and quite a few other things. By the way, at the end of this PowerPoint, I put on, so that you can see it later, lists of what certain things mean, you know, certain like butterflies mean and so on in Korea that might be helpful for you as you're looking at your works of art that you're going to be talking about. This is made of stoneware. Stoneware is a type of body of a ceramic that is, when fired at a high temperature, and it can be fired at a high temperature, you can put liquids in it and the liquids are not going to come out of it. Oops, I got to do something right now. Sorry guys, I just cannot have those crazy transitions. Who knows what kind? You guys will be glad I did this. Because, you know, you could get some sparkles and then that would be really sad. Don't ever have sparkles in your transitions. So thinking about the three bodies of clay, since we've been talking a little bit about stoneware, I just wanted to back up to say that we have earthenware that's often fired at a low temperature. And when it's fired, liquids can still come out of it. Okay, so that's something that we think about when we think of earthenware. Stoneware, it can be fired at a higher temperature and the body becomes really hard. And then porcelain, which is a white body that is made of kaolin and other things, and it's also fired at a high temperature, and it comes out kind of thin, and you can kind of do this and it rings. So those are the three bodies that we're thinking about when we think of ceramics. And here's an example of an earthenware vessel from very early. We don't have anything like this in our collection, so I'm just showing you an example just so you can see what it might look like. And you can see the decoration is actually kind of engraved and carved into the earthenware. This would have been fired at a low temperature, and is an example of very early earthenware vessel from Korea. We're still now in the Three Kingdoms. We're back to the Three Kingdoms, and here I just wanted to show you another stoneware another stoneware vessel that has quite a bit of this kind of decoration, where you could actually take a rough kind of material and press it on and mold on and create this decoration. And actually, this is a way that we're going to see some things being made later. So it's something that continues to happen. And then let's talk about glazes. So glaze is that coating that's applied to the exterior surface of the vessel. This, by the way, is porcelain. So we've seen earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. And it helps to keep the vessel from allowing liquids to go through, okay? And it contains a number of ingredients. And I think what's important to understand is when we're thinking about Korean vessels, Korean soil clay has a high content of iron, and it is also used as part of the glaze, and so that is going to affect how things look. Porcelain is fired at a very high temperature, as I said here. Now let's move on. The earliest glazes, by the way, y'all, were accidents. So wood ash would fall on the vessel and create these kind of shiny areas. And in fact, the early Korean potters would stoke those fires to make more ash fall on. And that goes back to that idea of Koreans kind of having the spontaneous aesthetic, right? And often some of the most valued works of art have that spontaneity to it. So I think that is an important thing to think about. These are two works from our collection. And from this time period, these works were found in multiples, many in the tombs of the dead. So in Korea, we have a system of burial where you have the dead buried with grave goods. And many of these were found probably when they were first put in many of the graves, they were filled with food. And then, of course, that has disappeared over time. But here I wanted to show you, this is a grave site. So they're just thrown in there, like a lot of them, okay? These, by the way, are easily reproduced. And so people going to Korea often will buy things like this, and they're not real. They're not from the time period. So just be aware of that. I think I know people who have done that, so. And then shamanism is, again, this kind of belief system that comes before Buddhism, before this time period, but was going to continue to be important in Korea at all levels. In the everyday world, it's going to be important, and also even at higher levels. So even when there is the belief in Buddhism, you're also going to have these kind of earlier belief systems that are still very important. And again, there's a belief in spirits that are part of the mountains, part of waterways, part of rocks, part of trees, and all sorts of other natural phenomena. So be aware that this is still something that is practiced today. Here, this is a picture of somebody, actually a shaman, practicing these worship rites. And to be aware that this is something that is kind of underlying the culture of Korea. Buddhism, as you probably are aware, arrived in Korea and around in the 4th century. And it becomes really important in the Shilla and the Koryo dynasty, and is still practiced by about a quarter of the population in Korea today. And this, we don't own this, but this is really kind of a magical bodhisattva. So as you know, bodhisattva a being that's done everything they need to do to go on to become, released from that endless cycle of death and rebirth, but is staying in our world to help those of us who are still here on our journey, on our spiritual journey. Okay, so we've talked a little, I just showing you some things about the three kingdoms. And these vessels, by the way, I just wanted you to be aware, because you will see them over and over again, just to be aware that these are very typical of this time period. So now we're getting closer to things that we actually have in our collection. And the Shilla, again, is unified. So the Shilla has, as I said, with the help of the Tang Dynasty, has unified Korea and rules in Korea. This is really interesting. None of these things do we own, by the way, but this is very interesting because we see a lot of these kind of gray ceramic tiles on the roofs of temples, of Buddhist temples in Korea. So this is a really beautiful decoration. And tile roofs were only for the most highest in society or the Buddhist temples. Let's look a little bit further here. I basically already told you this. So this is one thing that's important, and it's happening in the Shilla, and it's going to continue to happen as we move through time. And that is that we have an extreme hierarchy in Korean society in terms of elites and next level and so on. And you for the most part are stuck in those places in society. And in fact, you wear certain color clothing that's related to your place in society. You could have certain kind of building if you were higher up in society than others. Couldn't be in those same kind of buildings. So everything, and this really continues to echo in the culture of Korea for much of the time periods that we're going to be looking at. This really extreme put in your place kind of society that it's very rigid and very hard to get out of. And there are moments where we see changes in that, especially people who are under the most highest part of society. There's kind of some fluidity there. You have the royalty, and then the aristocrats are kind of right underneath. And you'll also have people who are studying when we get closer to our time period, studying for exams, much like what you have in China. And there's a little wiggle room there, but you don't see somebody from a much lower part of society being able to get up into this higher part of society through study, as you might have seen more likely in China. This was found, many of these kind of crowns were found in the tombs of important people from the Shilla time period. And this really has a lot of things that come from other places. So some of this, the trees and some of the other decoration here really are reminiscent of what was going on in the steppes. So went very far away and have come into the Shilla probably through that trade that we discussed and have been made into these beautiful crowns. So people of very, very high status would be buried with things that showed their status, right? So in the next life, nobody would be mistaken to believe that they were anything but of the highest status. And these were initially, when they were first found, they were believed to just be for burial purposes. But since then, it's been found out that they were used by the Shilla rulers as part of rituals. And the Shilla rulers were not only interested in Buddhism, but were also very important in the shamanistic beliefs. So some of those rituals were shamanistic rituals that the Shilla rulers would engage in. This is another crown cap, if you will. This is gold, and that was also found in a burial site. And at first it was thought to be an under crown, if you will. But then there have been wall paintings on tombs that show that this was actually the headgear that an important person would have worn. And this particular temple is a World Heritage Site. And in fact, I'm going to see if I can. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute because I have a little video, like 2-minute video of this particular temple that I thought might be interesting to you. So I'm going to go ahead and I had that up, but I'm going to see if it's still here. Okay, wait. Just bear with me. Okay.
Near the top.
Bear with me just 1 minute here, please, while I get this set up for you.
Image of the land of.
Okay. I had it all ready to go, but I was in class before this teaching, and I was teaching about Rome, and I guess I undid it. You know what? Excuse me 1 more minute. Y'all are being very patient. I appreciate it. Here we go. I want to make sure you could hear it. All right. This is just a little video of this particular temple. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to see it. And I think you should be able to hear what they're saying. It is kind of low, but.
Buddhist art of the Sila Kingdom, Sokguram Grotto and Bulguksa Temple. Bulguksa Temple is in the city of Gyeongju in southeastern South Korea. The dynasty of Sila united the Korean peninsula and built this temple complex using all its wealth and might. It's believed that one can leave the earthly world and enter the land of Buddha by crossing over these bridges and walking through this decorated gate. The Sila government tried to create a magnificent image of the land of Buddha and unify the people's spirit through Buddhism shortly after uniting the Korean peninsula. There is a statue of Vairocana Buddha right in the heart of the temple. Vairocana Buddha represents the vast wisdom of Buddha and illuminates everything that exists in the universe. Two stone stupas standing inside the complex have remained intact. Tabo Tap Pagoda on the eastern side is 10 meters high. The square-shaped bottom layer becomes octagonal and then round near the top. It symbolizes the stages of enlightenment. The pagoda is richly adorned with decoration so intricate that it resembles a carved wooden statue. The tower on the western side is called the Sokatap Pagoda. It's 8 meters in height. Kim Dae-sun, the founder of Bulguksa Temple, also built another temple during the same period. Buddhist guardians protect the entrance of this cave temple. There is a giant seated statue of Buddha inside, over 3 meters in height. Its dignified appearance expresses a determination to protect the country from foreign enemies. This site was created as a symbol of peace and national unity. It's a testament to the talent of craftsmen at the peak of the Sila dynasty and their remarkable interpretation of Buddha's world.
Okay. Awesome. So that's kind of cool. I thought that was kind of neat to see. But back to the PowerPoint. Oh, wait. They want to tell us more. Wait a second. Anyways, so just giving you an idea of what the architecture, temple architecture looked like during this time, during the Silla time period. So now we're going to move on to the Koryo, and this is where many of our works that we have in our collection are from this time period, and also the next dynasty. So this is, I think, where when you're touring these works of art, you want to kind of talk about why the work of art looks the way it does, right? So you want to kind of bring in a historical context or cultural context when you can. And let's start here. And I'm not sure if somebody is doing a report on this. I'm just going to talk about it briefly because it's so important. I really feel like this is one of our more important works, and it's really small. It's, maybe like this big. And it's from the 11th century. So it's right in the middle of the Koryo dynasty. And it is the Buddha of healing. And you can see here, I think, in this picture, how well worn this Buddha is. Somebody has been holding it and really meditating on this Buddha. And the Buddha of healing was used, of course, as something that somebody would pray to heal from sickness, but also have healing from, spiritual sickness, if you will. And so it's believed it was a personal icon, that somebody owned it and had it as on their person, as opposed to something that you would venerate in a temple or in another setting. And here, I think what's really great and what can be applied to other works of art that you might see when you're traveling for Buddhist works of art from this time period. The sloped shoulders is really something that comes from this time period in Korea, the way the sloped shoulders are here and how kind of thin it is also something that we often see from sculptures from this time period. And remember, at this time period, the Koryo dynasty is a time period where Buddhism is the state religion. So Buddhism is really intermingling with the legitimacy of the state. And so I think that's important to understand too, as we look at the works of art during this time period that are Buddhist related. And this time period, the Koryo dynasty, is the time period of Celadon ceramics. So Celadon is a later applied term, a Western applied term to this group of works and of course we know in China they had Celadon works as well, that were made we're talking now specifically about Korea, that were made during the Koryo dynasty. And this is a group of works, they're actually stoneware. They're not porcelain, they're stoneware. And they are fired in a reducing atmosphere. What does that mean? That means that there is not a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. So depending on whether or not you have a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, that is going to change the way the vessel looks after it's fired. And so these are fired in an atmosphere with a lot of smoke and not a lot of oxygen. That creates, along with the clay and the glaze, creates this beautiful, almost jade green color. And what's interesting is that these vessels have been, not our particular vessels, not the ones from our collection, but have been studied, and the composition has been studied, and it is found that the Korean clay in these vessels has a really interesting high percentage of iron that helps with the way the color comes out. And the other thing that's interesting about Korean celadons is you often have this kind of crackling effect, or all these crackles in the glaze, and you can barely see it here. But that is totally spontaneous. You can't control how the crackles come out, And so again, that relates to that idea that perhaps Korean aesthetic can sometimes be more spontaneous than other cultures. But that crackling is highly revered and treasured. It's wanted in the vessel. This type of celadon was only produced for the elites, the very highest in society in Korea, or for Buddhist, which, by the way, the Buddhist temples and leaders of the Buddhist philosophy or religion were very high in society, right? So during the Koryo time period, we had princes becoming Buddhist officials. So you had very high elites would have these ceramics, or they were also used for Buddhist rituals. They were not made for export. They were not made for export. And they were made in the south of Korea and then were brought to the capital. But they were found in the tombs of important people in China. And we have evidence that scholars of the Chinese Sung dynasty, who always thought their stuff was the best, by the way, in China, right? You know, I think a lot of people probably feel that way about their things and their culture, praising the Korean Celadon as being incredibly wonderful, like one of the wonders of the world. And partially it had to do really with the color. And you all understand and know, because you've been studying now Korean, Chinese culture. So you know that jade is highly revered in China, and that jade, for a number of reasons, it's a hard substance that is often a metaphor for a strength of character, right? And so jade, highly revered in China, and that important, I think, in Korea as well. But that color, right? That color, so important and special. Now, what you're noticing here, though, are the forms. There are forms of like melons and natural objects, like many times fruits. And so although the Koreans did learn about glazing in this color from China and from earlier Chinese vessels, much more blue, kind of green color, and sometimes we do see in Korean pottery some shapes that are reminiscent of earlier Chinese shapes. The shapes here are Korean. These are Korean shapes. These kind of melon shapes and shapes involving nature really come from Korea. And as I said here, by the way, this is your Chinese one. I just put this in here just to show you, we own this one, right? This is a Chinese Celadon, just padded in here. But just reminding you that reduction atmosphere that we talk about is when you have less oxygen, and that's when you get these kind of green glazes, okay? Just reminding you of that. So, yeah, this is the way that ceramics were made in state-sponsored kilns. They were made to look like this. There were other ceramics made for everyday people, and we're going to look at some in a minute. But these, again, were the elites. And generally speaking, in Korea, and I would say from this time period all the way through the next dynasty, there's a preference by the elites for kind of monochromatic or very simple decoration. That is their taste. So even when we get to a time period where in China, things are really, really being decorated really over the top, you're still going to see people or the elites in Korea preferring less decoration. And so that monochromatic decoration was just preferred generally by the elites. And Buddhism, again, very important during this time period. And the green color, often related in the Korean Buddhist mind with the pure mind of Buddhism. So kind of related to the actual belief system of the Buddhist culture in Korea during this time period. And then I put this quote because I think it's interesting. In Korea, the energy of the earth arises from the color of black, and it's the foundation, and blue-green. Blue-green is the body, you know, so very important color, generally speaking, during this time period. And here are some shapes that really are we see a lot of, and of course, you all know this shape, the Meiping vase. Comes over to Korea from China, but these shapes here are very much Korean shapes. Just seeing some more, just saw those. All right, and this is ours, and I want to say we're getting to the end of the really pinnacle of Celadon production right here. This 12th century is pretty much the end. It's still going to be produced, but the technology is going to change a bit. And you can see this color. If you just look at the color for a minute, just how fabulous the color is, right? And how this would have been so admired by the folks who were able, we probably could never hold this, but it would have been nice to. But look, they have secret decoration too. So I don't know, it's kind of hard to see here, but we have, this vessel also has had an image of flowers carved into the vessel. And this often happened with celadon. And then the glaze, which was kind of not too thin, right, would actually fill into these little areas and cause a darkening. And that's what you're seeing here. So this was a technique that was often used for celadon production in Korea. This is really beautiful. It's not on view right now, but it should be. It should be, but it's not. And then you can see that often carving, we saw a little bit of that just here, but even deeper carving would be used. And again, the glaze would pool in these areas, and that was a way of decoration. And here now you can see some of that crackling that would have been very much admired by the elites of Korea. The shape of this bowl absolutely comes from China, okay? And then, so this is really interesting too. This is also our bowl. And what we're seeing here is another way of decoration that is unique to Korea. So the Korean potters start to carve into the form, and then would fill in these carved in areas with slip. And of course, slip is a watery clay, and then would fire it with the glaze on top of it. And again, this is stoneware. This is a special type of decoration. It's called sangam, and it probably comes from inlaid metalwork. So it was probably inspired by inlaid metalwork. But this is something that was often done. And it took a lot of time to do this. It was very intricate and very difficult to make it work. So these were for the highest, the most important vessels. And here you can see again, you would carve, incise the design in here. And we saw that carving earlier where we'd see this, the glaze kind of pool in, right? And then you'd fill these areas with either a white slip or a dark slip. And then you would have celadon glaze on here, and it would be fired. Really beautiful, but it took a lot of time to make it. So you can imagine that these were for, very, very important people in Korea. But there were other people in Korea too. And there is a type of ceramic that was made for, let's say, the middle class, people who are not the elites, although many elites did have these in their possession as well, and bonchong. And this was made with stamps. So instead of hand carving all of the detail there, a stamp would be used to kind of press into the body of the clay of the vessel. By the way, this shape, very, very Chinese. Okay, this is a very traditionally, very ancient Chinese shape. And so the stamp would be put in, and then a white kind of slip clay would be smeared kind of over it. So it didn't take as long to do this. And so these vessels would be purchased by folks who were not the elites, although some had them in their possession. And here's another example where there's been a lot of stamping here. Also, you would see a little bit of carving, but just a lot of smearing of this white slip. And by the way, these vessels weren't as this clay, the body of the vessels as well, were not as fine. The clay that was used for the body of these vessels was not as fine as the clay that was used, the stoneware that was used for the celadon. So it was less costly to make, it took less time. And so it was a type of pottery that was available for people who were not of the highest rank. And by the way, it wasn't just a matter of being able to afford those celadons. You weren't allowed to have them, right? You were not the right status to own them, right? So this was a way of people who were not of that status to still have vessels that were quite beautiful. And they are really actually very engaging, because I think you see a little bit more of what we think of as a Korean aesthetic, really. When we look at works of art that are meant for the middle class of society and lower, much more vibrant, much more colorful, much more action in decoration. Yes, so this is so awesome. Now I'm going off art for just a second, but I mean, it kind of is art, I guess. So printing becomes really important in Korea. In fact, paper making that starts in China is really developed to a great extent in Korea, so much so that Korean paper is being bought and transported back into China. And one of the things, Buddhism, again, the state religion, right? Most important ideology during this time period. So the entire, all of the known Buddhist scriptures were carved into wood blocks, used to print all of the scriptures. And they did this earlier in the end of the 11th century in Korea, and then they were destroyed when the Mongols invaded. And so they were replaced, made again. And then they would make these wood blocks to print, and you can see the example here at the top. They would lacquer it and have this kind of really special process so to preserve these wood blocks. And today they still exist. So you can still, they are still in the world after almost 1,000 years because of that preservation. So 81,000 pieces of woodblock were made to be able to print these the entire Buddhist scripture that was known in Korea. The other thing that is interesting, and I think it's important to remember, okay? The first movable metal type for printing was made in Korea. That's right. No, it was not Gutenberg, right? It was made in Korea. And again, was made so that text could be printed, right? So books could be printed. And although the world's oldest movable metal printed book that's still in existence today is from 1377, we know that this printing started much earlier than that. So just to be aware that this is something that Koreans are very proud of, and rightfully so. So the Mongols invade towards the end of the Koryo dynasty, and it really is the beginning of the end of this particular dynasty. They wreak havoc on Korea, on many places that were destroyed during this time period. Much art was destroyed during this time period. They kind of dominate for about 80 years, and then the Koryo dynasty is able to get them out and break kind of the ties with that Chinese that was then at that point the Chinese dynasty, the Yuan dynasty. But they, in doing so, they lose power. They're perceived by the people in Korea as being, kind of corrupt, and they fall. That particular, the Koryo dynasty falls. And part of that perception was that we had this Buddhist philosophy / religion that was the state ideology, but they're also had become so wealthy and so powerful and so not seen really as being helpful to people, right? As instead taking advantage of people. And that was really intermeshed with the ruling class. So there's basically a bloodless coup, and they are put aside, and a new dynasty led by the Yi family. So often you might see this dynasty, we call them the Yi dynasty. For a while on our gallery labels, it was called the Yi dynasty, but I'm not sure now if they've changed that or not. But most often you're going to see it at the Joseon dynasty or Choson dynasty. And this particular dynasty is going to last for almost 600 years. And so you see at the very beginning, the first rulers agreeing that Buddhism and the kind of the administration of Buddhism has become too powerful and is again set aside. Instead, we have Confucianism becoming the state philosophy or state ideology. And we see Buddhism kind of falling away in terms of power, but it's still there, it's still present. And in fact, we have quite a few sculptures that are from Buddhist sculptures that are from that time period, which I'm not going to get way into because I don't want to like take away your steam or your, you know. But the other thing that's interesting that happens during this time period is that we see the Korean written language developed. So prior to this time, all writing that was done in Korea was done in Chinese characters, right? And you had to study, you had to study quite a long time, and you had to be a certain level in society to have the time to be able to study, right? To be able to write and read Korean characters. And King Sejong, which I'm going to show you his picture in a minute, but he realizes, other people need to be able to read. And so he has folks develop a writing system based on the way people speak in Korean. And it was meant for women and for people of lower classes. And it was very successful. And in fact, today in South Korea, there's 99% literacy, really high literacy rate, which has been that way for quite some time. So that's really interesting too. And here he is, King Sejong. And he says all of this stuff, but what he says the sound of our language is different from Chinese. And people want to express their sentiments in writing and can't communicate. I wish only the people will learn them easily and use them conveniently in their daily life. This is really interesting, right? Because he's taking knowledge and allowing it to be spread, right? As soon as you have, and we know this, I'm telling you, I know I'm telling you what you already know, right? But whenever we have in the history of the whole world, a moment where you have literacy increase, knowledge increase, you have a rising up of status, really, of daily life of an average individual. And so he did this very early. Really, it's interesting when we see the time period. We also see, of course, in the West, the Gutenberg press. And we already see that in Korea, there's a real interest in printing and in having access to information, right? And we see the same thing happening in the West with the printing press. We start to see knowledge spread, and literacy rise and changes within a couple of centuries for some folks. So yeah, I just told you this. Here he says, a wise man can acquaint himself with this new alphabet before the morning is over. A stupid man can learn them in a space of 10 days. And I've met people who have had to go be in Korea for their, for instance, I'm thinking of one woman whose husband was working there, really quickly learned to be able to read Korean. So I think it was very successful. I just showing you this because this is very typical of court portraiture during this time period in the Joseon dynasty. And you can see in anybody who's had taken a look at court portraiture in China is very similar, right? So there is this, during this time frame when we see Confucianism being really considered the ideology of the state, there is this looking to that kind of running of the state in China and how things are done there. And so there is a kind of a looking up to, if you will, of what was happening in China. Here, we could tell his status by what he's wearing here on his chest. And we see this throughout in China in the Ming dynasty and in the Qing dynasty, similar portraits, very similar in both dynasties. So definitely kind of again, big brother, little brother kind of connection between China and Korea during this time period. It's going to be helpful to Korea in a minute. I'm going to tell you why. So we have many sculptures, Buddhist sculptures made during the Koryo dynasty, made during the time when, made during the Joseon dynasty, during the time when Buddhism was put to the side, but there were still many people practicing it, including elites, and commissioning works like this. This is the Bodhisattva of Compassion. You all know, you're very knowledgeable about this now, that the Amitabha or Amida Buddha is in the crown here. But look at the face. The face is a little bit different, right, than what you've seen in China and in India. Because if you think about Buddhism starts in India, the face really reflects what the artist saw around them, right? The people around them. And so I just wanted you to be aware of that. And the only reason I'm showing this, I don't want to get all into this because I don't want to disturb somebody who's going to give a presentation on this, but notice this crown. Doesn't that remind you of something? It reminds you maybe of the early crown I was showing you from the Shilla. So, from about, I don't know, 700 or so, quite some time later, we're still seeing this kind of an echo looking back to what was important in an earlier time period. So I think that's really interesting. We have a couple, we have two Buddhist paintings from the Joseon dynasty, and all by themselves, just knowing that, by the way, this little sticker was just there in the picture. So that's why it's there. It was not part of the work of art. Just knowing that, they're amazing, because it's very rare to have still in this time today, Buddhist paintings from this time period. Yes, Buddhist sculptures, and Buddhist sculptures, they can kind of survive maybe a little better than paintings. So it's very rare to have a Buddhist painting from this time period, but we have one, and we actually have another as well. This is the Bodhisattva of Wisdom, and you all studied the Bodhisattva of Wisdom in China, right? You had the fellow on the lion. Oh, that lion with the beautifully coiffed mane, right? And he was sitting there, and he had the lotus. He was also sitting on a lotus throne on top of, between the lion and him. And he would have had a sword in his hand to cut through wisdom. It's cut through ignorance, right? Well, here in the Buddhist tradition, especially what we would call Zen Buddhist tradition, or the Seon Buddhist tradition in Korea, the Bodhisattva of Wisdom is often holding this, a Rui scepter. We have Rui scepters, so you can see those in. I don't know if they're up, but I think they are. Jade one. You can see them in our collection. So he holds this instead. And there are a lot of things that are surrounded this, and it's in the PowerPoint, and you can see it later, all sorts of conjecture. But I think the one that's most valid is that in Buddhist temples, especially in this time period, a Rui scepter was held and given to the next person. And when you held it, you were able to speak, right? So that it was a way of being kind of, okay, now I can speak, right? So I think that's mostly legitimate. Some people say it was like a back scratcher for the monks, so I'm not so sure about that. But what I want you to notice about this is he's sitting on a lion too. But this is not a Chinese lion. Here, let me see if I can show you. This is a Korean lion, okay? And we have, y'all, I know one of you is going to do it, so I didn't put it up. We have a bronze sculpture of a Korean lion, right? That's a drum stand. And I want you to examine that one on Wednesday when you're back in the galleries and look at that Korean lion, because that's also a Korean lion and not a Chinese lion with that perfectly coiffed hair, okay? Here we've got a lion. He's polka dots. He's almost like a pillow, okay? And look at our Bodhisattva of Wisdom. Yes, he's got the lotus blossom here, but he's got his feet on it. So this to me is so just beautiful in terms of color, but also Korean to me. That they're different cultures, and there is this deep tradition of color, dancing and music that comes from the everyday people, right? And so I think this really illustrates that kind of different way of looking at the world. Here's the picture of and of course, bodhisattvas are depicted as often wearing the garb of a princely figure. And here, this princely figure, this bodhisattva is, but the princely figure as one would see one in Korea. I think this is amazing. It's not up right now. It needs to get back up. And then, oh, by the way, a lot of times in Korea, when you see works that are on, and this is on fabric, this is on silk, often the works will be backed. And I'm not sure about this one. It talks a little bit about the backing, but I think it could be. I haven't seen the back, but often works that are on, for instance, on screens that are on silk, they're backed with like 6 sheets of mulberry paper that have been glued and then left to dry and then glued, like several sheets. So I'm not sure about this particular thing, but generally speaking in Korea, you're going to see silk backed with paper, with several layers of paper. Okay, so that's the technique that is used often in Korea. But here we have, and you all are doing so good listening to me, and I'm doing good. I'm not going to be taking your time too much longer. Here we have the Amitabha or Amida Buddha in paradise, and I think this is neat. This is ours. I haven't ever seen it up. But what's awesome about this is, we're always talking about the Amida Buddha and people, they say his name and then they go to paradise, right? But have you ever seen paradise? This is paradise. And if I get a little closer, all these white figures you're seeing here, they are people who have come to paradise. When you go to paradise, you come into the lotus pond. And so they've come to paradise and now they're climbing out of the lotus pond. All these figures are important, of course, important Buddhist figures. This is the Amida. There is the Bodhisattva, a different type of Bodhisattva of wisdom, different. And also the Bodhisattva of compassion, right? Or in China, Guanyin. But what's also neat about this is you get to see all the architecture, which I think is very cool. So just want to show you that. All right. I want to tell you a little ceramic side note, okay? Because this is interesting. Ceramic production comes to a virtual standstill after 1592. Why? Because Japan invades Korea. Now, prior to this time, for about 100 years, Japan had been basically warring states, many groups fighting each other, and they had been unified. And so the ruler who unified them was thinking, I want to conquer the world. And so what we're going to do is we're going to conquer Korea on the way to conquering China, because I'm awesome. And so they invade Korea, which is terrible. Okay. And this invasion, there was actually 2 invasions spaced a few years apart, are often called the Pottery Wars. And the reason they're called the Pottery Wars is because many potters, Korean potters, were taken out of Korea and brought to Japan and were basically never left Japan, and their families, and many of their families are still in Japan. And so when this war started, there were some special units that the Japanese ruler engaged as part of his invasion of Korea. And these special units were to get things like books and artisans, different types of artisans. An artisan often meant potter, and elite captives, captives you could negotiate to get money and ransom for, metal and treasure and livestock. So they're like not just invading to try to take over Korea, but also to take things back to Korea, from Korea to Japan. And this was a really devastating invasion. Much of the arable land in Korea was destroyed. So thousands and thousands of Koreans died, but then many, many, many more died of famine after, because of this invasion. So it was an incredibly horrible thing that happened. And in fact, there would be piles of skulls, and ears would be sent back to Japan to show all the people that had been killed, to show we're doing a good job. And eventually the invasions were not successful. And that was because China got involved and helped the Koreans and beat back the Japanese. This, by the way, is a Korean depiction of one of the battles. And here you can see the way these mountains are being depicted, very much something you might see in China. And there is always this there was this influence in painting, especially I think in Korea, an elite painting in Korea that was similar to China. So many people fought in these wars, including the Buddhist monks. So the king told the Buddhist monks they all had to get into the battle, and they did, and they fought very fiercely. And then also, so General Yi, this particular general is like still revered today. There are like sculptures of him in Korea, and he was instrumental in beating back the Japanese in the sea battles during this time period. And he had created the first armored sea vessel. And here you can see what it looked like. This is a replica, and armored all the way around and on top. So if you jumped on here, there were like spikes coming up. So if you were trying to get on top of there, you couldn't do it. And this is just a depiction. Now the Tong, excuse me, now we have the Chinese involved, and this is a depiction of the Chinese getting involved in that particular war. Why potters? Now I know some of you, and I can see one of you who probably knows the answer to that. But remember that we have in Japan, there has been for quite some time an importance to the tea ceremony. And I'm not going to get all into the tea ceremony here. There are people here who know it better than me. And the tea ceremony was often used for political purposes. And when it first was developed, very, very beautiful, fancy kind of works of art from China, ceramic works of art, often from China, were being used. And huge, these tea ceremonies were initially very huge. And then there was a shift to these more intimate tea ceremonies in these very small tea houses that basically you couldn't get in the door with your sword. There'd be a place for your swords outside, right? And a change, not from these very decorative, fancy kind of things to be used in the tea ceremony, to more simple things that were not perfect, kind of the imperfection. And there was a real love of the ceramics, especially for everyday people, that were being made in Korea. And they had been imported into Japan, and some of them even today are considered national treasures. And I think I have an example here of a bowl made in Korea that would have been used in these very high level tea ceremonies between important people in Japan. And the most southern part of Japan, Kyushu, this particular part of Japan was furthest away from the ruler of Japan, and were closest to Korea, and they were part of this invasion. And they other rulers that were I don't want to say rulers, let's say lords that were in other parts of Japan also brought Korean potters back, but quite a few of them were brought back to the southern part of Japan. And the technology that they brought with them kind of influenced how ceramics looked in Japan for some time, in that particular part of Japan. So, yeah. Yes. By the way, love this. I just love this. This is an amazing vessel. And I want to show you something that's very important. And that is the foot ring. So this is the foot ring of this vessel. And you can see how rough the clay is, right? So it's really not just only fired with burn marks, which were very highly valued. by the Japanese, but other kind of moments of imperfection here, as you can see in the shape and so on, right? But the ring just really shows us a lot about the content. So we've talked about, this is the Celadon from the Koryo dynasty, and then this was also made in the Koryo dynasty. This in between that was made for the middle class folks in the Koryo, and then into the Joseon. And now we're going to be thinking about the ceramics that were made in the Joseon period. So once we have this kind of invasion, it makes it so, you know, it really changes a lot of things in Korea. We see status of folks rising because we have less folks, and this happens in other moments in the history of the world, right? And we see changes for everyday people. By the way, people who made vessels, who made ceramics in Korea were basically slaves. They were maybe paid with food and lodging, and that was it. And there were many slaves in Korea that were engaged in the kind of lowest, they were considered craftsmen. They were not considered artists. No Korean ever signed their ceramic pot, okay, during this time period. But eventually ceramic production returns, and there's a focus on white monochromatic wares and blue and white works. And what we see in the Joseon period is in the prior period, in the Koryo period, many of the kilns were in the south. And then we see the kilns moving up near the capital, up to where the capital is, in an area that had enough good water and fuel and other things. So, and we see in this new dynasty, right, in the Joseon dynasty, this Confucian viewpoint. And so why does the art look the way it does? Well, white, the simplicity of the white ceramic reflected those kind of Confucian values. And the rulers, the early rulers of the Joseon dynasty, they were the only ones who could have white ceramics. They didn't want anyone else to have white ceramics. And so even some of the elites couldn't have white ceramics. So instead, they were allowed to have white with a little either blue or red decoration. This is a moon jar, by the way. And sometimes you can see the seams in these larger forms. I'm trying to see if I can show you it here, but I can't really see it with the reflection in Korea. And that was never a problem. That was fine. It wasn't like you had to hide it. In other cultures, you might have to hide those seams. So here are some examples of what would have considered the highest art form in terms of ceramics in the Joseon dynasty. And again, you can see the white. Now, white was many colors of white. It could be an ivory white. It could be kind of blue white. There were many colors of white when we're looking at a porcelain from this time period. By the way, I just wanted to show you this. This is ours, and it is white, so it's really beautiful. It's been repaired and probably repaired with gold on top. This type of repair we see a lot of in Japan. And so I think it's very interesting that this happened. We know that there were Korean bowls that were made in Korea and then imported to Japan. If they broke, they would be repaired with gold. So I think that's very interesting. This is our bottle. And it's actually really great. This should be out. This is a really great example of what I was talking about. So this is underglaze, red underglaze, where there are only two colors that could be made on a porcelain vessel and put on the porcelain vessel before it was high fired and still stay the right color. And one of them is this that would turn into a red, and the other was a blue. And so this is a red underglaze, and we see red underglaze coming into Korean ceramic production earlier than the blue and white. And just some incredibly fine examples. And here you're seeing what is very much the type of decoration you're going to see on elite vessels in Korea. And that is very simple and monochromatic, right? So the whole vessel is not covered, just a kind of simple decoration, which was very This is incredible. This is from the 1900s. So this is kind of reflecting back, right? And you have the Meiping base shape, but look at this incredible decoration. You can see why a culture like Japan in that time period was interested in the beauty, but the beauty of imperfection would have admired something like this. And this is ours on the right. And this is from the Met. And again, I'm just trying to show you that aesthetic, that was of Korea, that was different than what was going on in China in the Qing dynasty, the same time period, where you have decoration, but it's monochromatic, it's one color, and it doesn't cover the whole vessel. It's not filled. And you can see an example here. This is from the same time period in China. And you can see it's just totally covered, right? Because that was more of the aesthetic here. And actually, this is a really interesting vessel. It's got beautiful, it's beautiful. But you can just see the difference in aesthetic when you're looking at China and Korea, very different aesthetic. Another example. I want to finish up. So these are ours. Just showing you some. And then we have a great example of a pickle jar. And these could be, this one's about this big. But these could be really big, and they would sit outside of a common person's home and they would pickle things, not just cabbage, but all sorts of things in these jars. And so this is an example of what an everyday person would have. These facets were cut with a knife. So to create these kind of facets here, and you see the hand of the artist along here as well. Really beautiful. I'm going a little faster now. So we already talked about Confucianism in Korea and how important it was during this Joseon dynasty. And you all have learned about Confucianism. And so you understand the 5 human relationships: ruler, subject, parent, child, elder brother, younger brother, husband, wife, friend, right? I just want to say to you that it was a very rigid type of Confucianism here, where all aspects of your life was kind of seen through that lens. And so the way your home was decorated, the way your home looked, your responsibilities, all very much regimented through this type of Neo-Confucianism in Korea. Very, very regimented kind of Confucianism. And I'm just showing you the room. So when you're in a Confucian home during this time period, you have the women's quarters and the men's quarters. And so the women had their own private quarters, and they had certain things they had to do, they were taught to do from an early age. Here are their 7 friends: needle, scissors, spools, thimble, ruler, thread, small iron. And we have some of these rulers that are, excuse me, are now, excuse me, are up right now. And so they're interesting. They're really beautiful. So I wanted to show you this, but we also have that dresser or that chest. I'm sure somebody's doing that lacquer chest, and that would have been put in the woman's quarters in the home. And then this is one of ours. So this is one of the rulers. Isn't that gorgeous? I mean, really beautiful. And this is the chest. And I'm not going to, go all into this except to say, you can see here that it is on a rack here. The floors in Korean homes were heated through the floor. So you had this up off the floor. This is 2 pieces here. And there are many, many symbols of good fortune all over this chest, which has got mother of pearl inlaid. And these are Chinese characters, and they are also, they have meanings related to good fortune. We have butterfly, we have all sorts of things that again go back to symbols of good fortune. And lacquer had been used, this is lacquered, had been used for centuries and centuries in Korea. Of course, it was in China and Japan as well. And during this time period, the mother of pearl, very important. And of course, lacquer, layers and layers and layers of lacquer to create this. So I know that somebody's probably going to be talking about it, so I don't want to do too much. This is a lot of talking, a lot of writing, which don't do this when you're giving a talk. But I just thought it was interesting. This is actually 1468. It was talking about the wife, and her duties, and that you have to train. You can't just train your sons. You have to train your daughters, and she's got to respect her. She serves her parents-in-law. If she's not sincere and respectful, she cannot fulfill her filial loyalty. She treats the servants well. She only if she's sincere and respectful in serving her superiors and kind and benevolent in treating her subordinates is there complete affection between husband and wife. So she has to do all her duties really well, or else he's not going to be affectionate to her. And generally, she should also be accomplished in female tasks. And if she's not diligent, she lacks the capacity to lead her subordinates. So I don't know. I just thought this was very interesting because there were many duties that the wife had. And this is the man's part of the quarters, and it would be where he would receive people. So everything is very modest here, right? Compared to what we saw before. And this was something that we often see in the male quarters in the Confucian time period in Korea. And so you can see everything's very minimalistic. And his 4 accomplishments were calligraphy, painting, music, and this board game. So I just thought that was kind of interesting to see these. These are replicas of what would have been. And there comes a point in the Joseon where getting the blue becomes really cost prohibitive. So you start to see very little blue and white porcelain being made, but you still see it in these little water droppers. So these are water droppers that would have been on the desk of a scholar in Korea, just as you would imagine in China. And these were all made in Korea. So these are up right now. So they're quite beautiful. This is ours. And it is how are we doing? How are you doing? Are you getting tired? How are we doing?
Well, it's about 11:30. How much more do you have? Should we take a break, or what do you think?
I really don't have that much. I think I can finish like in 10 minutes. Can you guys hold off for 10 minutes?
Sure. Okay, I think that works.
And then I'll let you go. All right. So y'all, one thing that's very different in the Joseon dynasty is that we have the kings will have screens behind them. So they will have screens instead of other types of decoration behind them. And normally for much of the period, they had screens like this that have the 5 peaks that represent the five elements, right? Earth, fire, wind, water, metal. And then you have the sun and the moon, which kind of represent the yin and the yang, the 2 sides of kind of being, if you will. And so this is typical of what would have been behind the king. Now, by the way, the screens that were like this, none of them still exist. And this, of course, is a replica made, and now we own it, which is nice, but it's not up. But during this period, we see different type of screen being put behind the ruler. And that was what some of you have seen before, and I've shown you are the books and things screen. So you're seeing that here. And just to let you know that during this time period, books in Korea were the only access that you could get to them was through the king. And so these larger books are Korean books. These smaller ones are Chinese books. And in order to get the Chinese books, you had to travel there or find somebody who had been there to get those books. So people would have screens like this. And first the king had this behind him, something like this. And then the elites had these screens to kind of show that they were scholarly, even though they didn't have a lot of books, and that they had these things, because the other part of what was happening in this time period was there was kind of a restriction on owning objects. You could own a few objects, but you couldn't go over the top in this time period. So people would have screens like this as kind of a substitute for those things. This is ours. And so this is really kind of what these screens become. So at first they're the king and the elites. Then over time, you start to see them in everyday homes and even everybody has them. And even things like this, which this is almost like a pattern for what would eventually be put on a screen like this. You see. So we own this. This is ours. So it's kind of interesting. And then this is also ours. So we own two that are like, kind of a echo of those screens that were initially used behind the king. And then the last thing I want to just talk about briefly, and then we're done, is this time period when Japan colonizes Korea, which was a brutal time period. Okay. And let me just say this before I look. People today still remember that. Okay, so when you are touring people from Korea or people with Korean history, they remember that brutal period of when Japan colonized or basically took over and put Korea under their, a lot of pressure. So please know that. So when you are giving a tour in our East Asian galleries, be aware of that. Be aware that this was something that happened that is still something that people care about today. Okay, and in fact, in Japan, you have I love Japan. I've been there and I love it. Okay, and I love the people in Japan, but there are still issues in Japan with people from Korea. People from Korea often don't get the same rights, even if their families have lived there for generations. So that's something to be aware of. I think we have to be aware of that when we're in the galleries. That we elevate and respect all cultures, right? But we don't think that they're the same, because they're not. And so let me just say, so during the time that Japan had colonized Korea, Koreans were not allowed to use Korean names. They had to change their names. Many people died. Many people were not allowed to do anything that related to their Korean culture. So there was almost a striking away of culture. And this is a painting by somebody who was painting during the time of Korean occupation, and he was very successful as a painter. So he was painting for the elites in Korea, which at that time were the Japanese. And he went to an important art school. He made works like this. He becomes very, very well established. He gets a lot of awards. And as soon as the Japanese leave, he stops painting like this and he starts painting like this, which are images of Korean culture, but also that reflect a type of painting that comes from an earlier pre-colonial, if you will, Korea. So looking back not only to the culture of Korea, but also to the painting forms of that earlier time period. So here you're seeing a sword dance, which was something that started in the military, and then ladies did it. Ladies wearing outfits that kind of look military. It was a very traditional type of dance. And so he made many paintings, a series of paintings of traditional things that Koreans did, and how traditional Koreans looked, with their culture. And of course, 1946, who were buying these? Of course, there were people from here, right? Who were there, who bought these and brought them back, and that's why we see them today. He eventually paints things like this, and then eventually like this. So he changes his style over time. So that's where I'm going to end it. That's not so bad. You guys have been great. And look, you learned about Korean art and culture, but you also learned about ceramics, and it only took an hour and a half. I don't think that's terrible.
I think that's great. Thank you, Allie.
So I know I took longer than an hour, but this way you don't have to keep hearing me talk. So.
Does anybody have questions for Allie? Comments?
So quick question. Hi, Allie.
Hi.
The last artist was Korean, painting
Yes.
during that time of invasion. Okay.
Yes.
Very interesting history on him.
Yeah, so you're going to see actually, and I want to just say, because I was rushing, but I want to say that he wasn't the only one. So there were artists that were painting in the time of Japan,
The occupation.
colonization, that were painting to that audience, for that audience, And then as soon as they left, many of the artists shifted their style and their subject matter, like immediately,
Did he stay? Did he stay in Korea?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, Sandra, what can I do for you?
Well, I just want to tell a little story that you actually referred to. I lived in Tokyo for 14 months since 87, 88, and I had a couple little kitties, baby, and a 3-year-old. And I had an extraordinary Japanese neighbor in the apartment building, Chisayo, who was so kind to me. And it's painful to talk about her because she moved and I lost her address, and I didn't even get to thank her or send reciprocal gifts the last time she sent things to us. And anyway, but there was a Korean woman with 2 small boys in the building as well. And I could see women in the park giving them the cold shoulder and everything. But of course, Chisayo took them under her wing as well. So we were all friends, and we would have Korean barbecue with those gigantic pieces of lettuce in my kitchen. Anyway, it just reminded me of.
Yeah, I think it's important too to see, to understand and know that not every, like I said, I've been to Japan, and I really respect the people that I met, and I respect the culture. I love the culture. So we can't say that all people are always right. But I think what we do need to know is just to be sensitive to that aspect of that relationship, that just to be sensitive to it. You don't need to. I guess what I'm trying to say is, each culture is different, and they have influenced each other, as they always do, and especially in proximity to each other, as they do. But it's the same thing as saying, all Korean art is derivative of China. And I've heard that. I've heard people who don't know say that. And please don't ever say that. Because you can imagine, what if everybody said that all American art is derivative of Europe? Well, that's not really true, is it? We've got a lot of art that is, think of abstract expressionism. Come on, man. You know what I mean? So, we just have to be careful with that.
Linda?
Yes, I just wanted to share another story about the Japanese Korea exchange. In the late 60s, I was living in LA, and there was a small Japanese market near me that was really about the only place left anywhere that you could still get live, fresh abalone. And one of the nurses I worked with was Korean, and she asked me if I would get her some abalone. I said, well, why don't you get it? She said, he won't sell it to me. He wouldn't sell it. And I didn't know about the Japanese Korea thing at that time. And she said, and I asked her why, and she said, it's because I'm Korean. He said, how does he know that? And she said, because of my name.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, you can see that there is some intolerance between many cultures, and there is intolerance, between some folks of these two cultures. And, I mean, I think now that you're sensitive to it, I'm sure you already were, but now I think when you're out in the world, when you go to, a place that has many different Asian foods, right? Like a supermarket, I'm trying to remember, 99 Ranch.
Yeah.
A lot of different cultures in there, and people of different cultures working. I think you'll be really sensitive to it, and you'll see what we're kind of describing here. Hi, yes, Jojo.
Yes, I have a question. I've been to Japan and Korean a couple times, but the first time when I went to Korean is maybe 35 years ago, and I'm walking on the street, I can see a lot of Chinese characters. And now, if you go to Seoul, you rarely see Chinese character, and the pronunciations are different, a little bit different. is it, when do they start to this kind of change, or is there anything behind that?
I think, Jojo, that's a really great question. And that brings us back to kind of the foundations of writing and the elites in Korea. So the elites in Korea, almost all the way to this present day, I would say, and probably about the time that you're talking about, still learned to read and write Chinese characters, right? Because that's kind of the elevated that related to their elevated status. And again, really, really structured society, right? And so you had that, and that was also a way, right? When you're in Korea and you're going somewhere, of saying what kind of establishment this is. Do you know what I'm saying? But now I think in the modern age, there's been a trend away from that as much. There's still, I think there's still some elements of structure in the society, but there's this wanting to break that, in the modern age. So I think maybe that's what was happening. But you're right. I mean, in China, I do want to say that China absolutely influenced Korean society with Confucianism, and Buddhism came in through China, and art. There's a lot of art forms that were informed of, ceramics, for instance, and painting as well, and really influenced Japan, right? In the elites, especially in elite art, you see Japanese painting that's very much inspired by Chinese painting. So absolutely a very important source of inspiration, but we want to make sure that we give room for each culture to have their own.
Yeah, the only thing for me is if I go to Japan, I do not speak Japanese, but by looking at the characters, I pretty much can guess where here is, and it still exists in Japan, but I see the changes in Korean, especially if you go to Seoul. It was not called Seoul like 35 years ago. It called Hancheon, right? So I will be able to tell which way do I go. But now it's all different. It's their own caricatures, and you can see less and less Chinese character there. And they put their own character with English name under it. So that's just different impression that I have.
Yeah, I was going to say that the other thing is that, South Korea now it's a modern state that's really, interacting with other cultures at a really, high technical level. And I think that, you're right. The Korean characters are so different, right? Because they're just so different. They are meant to relate to the Korean verbal language, which is very different. And so, yeah, it would be really weird. It would be kind of like, me going to Japan, when I'm in Italy and France and Spain, I can basically understand what I'm reading, even if it's in those languages, but not in Japan. You know what I mean? So I can totally get your point of view.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, Allie, you touched on this, but I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about embracing imperfection, or what we might consider imperfect. You showed us that picture that is ours but not on display, that looks to me like it has imperfections in the glaze and so on. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes. So, and I think that is something that we see throughout Korean culture, especially in folk art, but also in some of the elite arts, including the Celadon ceramics, which were the highest art form in Korea during that time period. And it's that it's not so much the spontaneity, it's the not being in charge, letting nature affect the way the art looks, right? And there's this reverence for nature and reverence for the forces of nature. And so that comes into the works of art. When you were looking at that simple tea bowl that is now a cultural treasure in Japan, those types of works were made for everyday people. And that whole kind of type of works, including pottery, but also other things that were made for everyday people, become really inspirational to Japanese, not only during the time that I discussed, which was the Pottery Wars, but then later during the Menkei movement in Japan. Initially, it was Japanese, the leaders of that movement were looking initially at Korean pottery and art that was meant more for the people of Korea, not the elites, and were inspired by that, and then moved to looking at those same types of works of art in Japan. So that kind of, we kind of have these words that are used with Korean art, like spontaneity and earthiness and so on, and those are really great. But I think that's partially what's going on in the culture, but to understand too that they also had these incredibly perfect works of art as well. So it was kind of, to understand that we see that generally, but to not put all Korean works of art in the box, right? Just like everything else that you discuss as you move through all these different places and time periods. Does that make sense? Did I even speak to what you asked? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's great.
I love it. So I don't want to put myself telling you what I think.
Anybody have any other questions for Allie? Okay, great. Thank you, Allie. That was wonderful.
So if you all have, I'll send that. So I will send that thing out to you that I did for the Korean Cultural Society. And if you have any specific questions, especially if you're doing a report on one of these works, and I don't know if you are or not, feel free to ask me. Okay. Just give me an email. All right. I'm going to let y'all go. See you later. Have a good rest of your day.
So we just have a couple of things and then we can let everybody go early, but I know Sina has something she wants to share with us.
Am I doing that now?
Yes.
Okay. This is really quick. Okay. So I